Welcome to a brand new episode of Law and Batting Order. I'm your host, Tony Iliakostas. Here are some quick hits from the past 2 weeks. Attention football fans, get ready for the Har Bowl. This year's Super Bowl will feature a very unique matchup between two head coaches who are brothers. John Harbaugh's Baltimore Ravens took down the Broncos and the Patriots to reach their second Super Bowl in franchise history. Meanwhile, in the NFC, the San Francisco 49ers returned to glory as Jim Harbaugh's squad took down the Packers and the Falcons. While the 49ers have an edge on offense, both teams have very potent defenses, and I believe this game will boil down to defense. The 49ers and Ravens will face each other on February 3rd, and my hunch tells me that the Ravens will escape with the Super Bowl win down in New Orleans. The speculation is over. Lance Armstrong, the American cyclist who gripped the attention of millions during the late 90s and early 2000s with his 7 consecutive Tour de France wins, came clean last week in an exclusive interview with Oprah Winfrey about using performance-enhancing drugs. Armstrong admitted to using testosterone, EPOs, and other performance-enhancing drugs in an effort to gain an advantage in the sport of cycling. In a very coy fashion, Armstrong also talked about how his teammates on his cycling team also took part in using performance-enhancing drugs during several cycling races, including the Tour de France. A little later in today's episode, I'll be discussing Lance's confession and the legal ramifications that could ensue. It's not often you hear bizarre stories in sports, but this week marked one of the most bizarre headlines in college football history and perhaps all of sports history. In an exclusive interview by Deadspin.com, it was discovered that Notre Dame linebacker Manti Te'o was the victim of a hoax involving his so-called girlfriend. From the details that were gathered, it was believed that Manti Te'o's girlfriend, who he met online, had died in September 2012 of leukemia. However, in December 2012, Te'o discovered that he had really been the victim of a very elaborate hoax. Many wondered if Te'o was in on it, but he has adamantly denied any involvement. He has made it very clear that he was a victim. The person behind the hoax has come out and apologized for his actions, but this may not be the last we hear about the Manti Te'o catfish scandal. Today's Order in the Court will be taking a look at Lance Armstrong's recent confession to using performance-enhancing drugs. For years, there has been speculation that American cyclist Lance Armstrong had been using performance-enhancing drugs during his 7-year Tour de France title run from 1998 to 2005. And alas, after years of wondering, Lance Armstrong finally came clean in an exclusive interview with Oprah Winfrey talking about his PED use. The discussion has now shifted from when Lance will come clean to what will happen as a result of coming clean. To help us break down this interview and the legal ramifications that could ensue for Lance Armstrong, it is my privilege to interview Owen Seitel. Owen is the co-founder and partner of his firm Idell & Seitel, which is based in San Francisco, California. His firm specializes in sports and entertainment law, among other areas of law, and Owen is also an adjunct professor at Golden Gate University School of Law. Owen, welcome to Law and Batting Order. How's it going?
Thanks, Anthony. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming along. So, just like me and millions of other Americans around the world, around the country and around the world too, we all had the opportunity of witnessing Lance Armstrong confessing to using performance-enhancing drugs on television in an exclusive interview with Oprah. What were your initial thoughts about Oprah's interview with Lance Armstrong? Do you think Oprah asked all the right questions? And more importantly, was Lance Armstrong successful in answering those questions?
Well, first of all, I think Oprah did a great job. I think it's important to recognize that this was a voluntary interview. It was not a deposition. It was not a cross-examination. I've heard some people complain that Oprah failed to follow up on certain items or failed to get details, on how it all worked and so on and so forth. But I think for what it was quite well done. And overall, to hear Lance categorically admit to doping during his Tour de France run was, for someone like me who followed that closely, throughout, it was shocking, given how vehemently he denied it for many, many years. Lance made it clear that he was not interested in the context of that interview of implicating others in the doping efforts. And I think that was somewhat reasonable for him to take the position in the context of the interview. I mean, there's, he's done enough damage. I don't think he needs to go on TV and start naming names at this point. So that really limited Oprah's ability to get the details of the doping effort. And that effort clearly had to involve multiple people, and probably even involve people higher up the food chain than Lance. Perhaps, team owners, race officials, maybe even officials at UCI or other governing bodies. So I think those details will be left to sworn testimony that he'll give to USADA officials if he ever does so. But I think overall, it was a good interview. I think he, in the bulk of it, answered the big questions that we all had. And like I said, for a guy who spent the last decade vehemently denying it, to hear him, come in and say, yeah, I doped during the entire 7-year run, that's pretty shocking stuff.
Yeah, definitely. And, again, like you alluded to, which is correct, he's not in a position to necessarily point fingers, but from a personal perspective, he himself needed to come clean. So now shifting to the next question, relaying to that same theme, how important was it for Lance Armstrong to come out on national television and confess to using performance-enhancing drugs?
Well, let me kind of start out and first say that I am pretty certain that any lawyer that was advising Lance would have told him that he's absolutely insane to even consider engaging in an interview like this, given the exposure to civil suits that'll follow, and even the potential exposure to a criminal sanction. Now, I'm pretty sure that they considered the exposure to criminal sanctions first and foremost, and probably came to the conclusion that it's pretty low risk. It seems pretty likely that a statute of limitations on a perjury claim arising out of the sworn deposition he gave in the SCA lawsuit is probably expired. So the bulk of his exposure is on the civil side. I've heard reports that Lance amassed assets in excess of $100 million, and he's going to lose a large chunk of it, if not all of it. So I don't know. I don't know what his motivation is. I mean, that to me is the big question that remains outstanding. I just don't understand his motivation. Maybe he just, he's tired of lying and he needs to get it off his chest, and maybe that's all there is to it. Call me a cynic. I mean, I think that's probably not it. That there are other thoughts he has. But that remains to be seen. The one thing that came out of the interview is that Lance is and always has been a control freak. Mm-hmm. He always sought to control the narrative, and I don't think anything's changed in that regard. I think it was pretty clear. He sought out this interview, and he continues to try to control the narrative here. So I think he was going to do this despite what the lawyers told him. And like I said, I'm certain they told him not to do it. So if his priority was to maintain his assets, he should have just kept his mouth shut and slipped out of public consciousness with his $100 million. Some say he did it because he wants to get his lifetime ban lifted to compete in sanctioned events. Maybe that means a lot to him. I just don't know. I mean, he's certainly past his prime in terms of, he's not going to win the Tour de France again. But, he may be able to go, he'll go race the Leadville 100 again, or he may be able to enter into a random triathlon or so on and so forth, and compete and maybe even win. But there's not going to be any significant prize money, and he's certainly not going to get any sponsors anymore. So he certainly didn't do this for monetary reasons. Maybe he just needed to get it off his chest. I just don't know. I think his motivation will come clear, as this story continues to unfold.
Sure. So now Lance took pretty long pauses during some of the questions, particularly regarding the means by which he and the rest of his U.S. Postal Service cycling team had used performance-enhancing drugs during these races. And there was at one point where he almost, like he was ready to crack out the Kleenex, but it didn't really happen. Just when he was talking about how he came clean to his son, when he came clean about using performance-enhancing drugs to him. But otherwise, he was pretty even-keeled. He was pretty, calm throughout the entire interview. What were your thoughts on Lance's body language, and what conclusion could you draw from his demeanor?
Yeah, well, he did take some long pauses. I think, as he stated, one ground rule that he set for himself, and in the context of the interview, was that he was not going to name names in that interview. So I'm certain that when he was asked a question, he was trying to rack his brain. How can I answer this without implicating a bunch of individuals? So I think there may have been an element of that, and that's hard to do when you're talking about what I think again probably involved a lot of people in the whole doping scheme. But and then again, I think it was really, really hard for Lance to do this. He is well aware that for the past 10 years he's denied it vehemently. He's well aware that he personally attacked anybody that contradicted him, and just went full bore on them. So, it's to get up there and admit that you've been a liar for the past decade, that your Tour de France victories that provide the basis for your entire empire were all built on this doping effort. That's tough to do. Sure, he's going to pause, he's going to hesitate, and so on. He was quite even keeled. Certainly other people doing an interview like this would have had to stop every 5 minutes and get the tissue box out. But the one thing I knew about Lance before, and the one thing that I think was apparent as you're looking at this interview, is this is a pretty cold, hard MFer. This is a guy who he's some would say that this is a man of singular focus. Others would say, that this is a guy that's just incapable of human feeling and emotion. I don't know what it is, but that's who this guy is. I don't think that. I just think he's a guy that's always had a chip on his shoulder. That he's motivated by that. That he kind of sets up. He's always set up a paradigm where, he is the victim, and being falsely accused, and so on and so forth. And so that's kind of his MO. And I just don't think that that's going to change overnight, if ever. So, I think we're seeing who this guy is to some extent.
Sure, and I guess that really falls back on the whole theme of him being a control freak. Who knows? But what was the biggest surprise during the interview? Was there something that Lance Armstrong that particularly shocked you, or was there something that he said that piqued your interest?
Well, I can't say that, given the lead up to the interview, I wasn't shocked. I think we all expected him to fess up,
sure,
prior to the interview, because, we were basically told that that's what was going to happen, and that's what happened. There were a couple things that I found really interesting. I thought his answer where he said that, that doping was just something that you did in a bike race. He said we made sure that there was air in the tires and water in the bottles, and quote, we took care of that other thing, I think is how he put it. And then, and then he went on even further and say that at the time he really didn't even think he was cheating, and I think in a vacuum I would find that hard to believe, but for anyone who's followed professional cycling for the past 10 or 15 years, maybe that's not so surprising. What is pretty clear is that the sport was rife with doping in the 90s and into the early 2000s. You just look at all the riders during that period that doped out. I mean, Miguel Indurain, a recent winner of the I'm sorry, not Indurain, Contador, Alberto Contador, another Spanish rider. He recently won the Tour de France. He got stripped of his title for doping, but they couldn't even hand the title to the next finisher or the one after that because those guys doped out too. So you got a month-long sporting event, the Tour de France, for which the record books will forever show there was no winner. And that's, that is the unfortunate culture of professional cycling. And if you're living and competing in that culture, maybe it just doesn't seem like cheating. And that's a problem for professional cycling that goes far beyond Lance. I think what Lance, is doing there is, I think he's at the very least implicitly saying is, hey, this was the milieu, this was the environment that I competed in. So, if you were going to play on that stage, you had to dope, and everybody knew it. Myself as a fan of professional, believe Lance, I knew it. You could see people doping out all the time, and so you knew what was going on there, and but it was nonetheless really interesting to hear just how kind of ingrained in the culture of the sport it was, at least according to Lance. And and I think he's the guy to tell us what the deal was at the time.
It really is unfortunate that a sport like cycling is a dirty sport. It really is, and it is a shock. Now, one discussion that has been brought up is the possibility of the Department of Justice reopening charges against Lance Armstrong, and in particular, the DOJ is determining whether or not to join Lance Armstrong in the federal whistleblower case that was initiated by his fellow teammate, American cyclist Floyd Landis. And the issue in that case is that under the False Claims Act, Lance Armstrong defrauded the U.S. Postal Service of $30 million, which they sponsored to the team. So what do you think will develop from that case, Owen?
Well, I think the interplay of that whistleblower suit here is the most fascinating thing of all on many levels. I think, as you noted, it's a whistleblower suit filed by Floyd Landis, a former U.S. Postal Service teammate of Lance, and he's filed this claim under the False Claims Act, asserting that the U.S. Postal Service, a division of the federal government, that was defrauded by the team out of the millions it paid to support the team, and that support was based in part on the representation of the team and its members were competing, within the rules, drug-free, so on and so forth. So, as you indicated, right now the DOJ is considering whether to join in that action. And if it does, essentially the DOJ will take over prosecution of that claim, which is highly significant because the DOJ has much more resources to prosecute that action than Floyd Landis's private attorneys do. But either way, that suit is going to move forward. And if successful, Landis is in line to keep, as a whistleblower, he's in line to keep 15 to 25% of the recovery. So this is a claim for more than $30 million. So, Landis could be in line to collect $5 to $8 million. And what I find interesting here is that, when it's all said and done, the guy who may come out of this with a couple of bucks in his pocket is Floyd Landis. And here's a guy who was left flat broke, shunned by the entire cycling community. And he certainly did some things, especially in the context of his arbitration hearing, and he tried to hack into computer systems, and he Floyd's no angel, which again is why I just find it fascinating that out of this whole thing, the guy who could come out of this, okay, is Floyd Landis. So it's just it's just ironic, if anything.
Yeah, it definitely is, actually. Now let's move from the federal landscape to now the scene in the civil courtroom, because a lot could develop from there. We know, based on the headlines that we've read and based on Oprah's interview with Lance, that Lance Armstrong would do everything in his power to stop people who accused him of using performance-enhancing drugs. in his case, that meant bringing a lawsuit against those people who, quote-unquote, wrongfully accused him of using performance-enhancing drugs. So will we expect future civil litigation from those people who Lance Armstrong sued?
Maybe. Certainly SCA Promotions, which is, the company that paid him the $5 million bonus for winning the Tour de France's 4, 5, and 6, they're going to try to get their money back. I mean, they're making noise. They're saying, we're here, waiting for the check in the mail. And so, they're going to, at this point, they're demanding that Lance return $12 million, and that's, the $5 million plus legal costs and interest and all that kind of stuff. So, I'm kind of curious to see what happens there. Certainly, the most sympathetic parties here are the individuals that Lance really viciously attacked when they brought forth these doping allegations. I'm thinking of a person like Emma O'Reilly, who was the masseuse for the U.S. Postal Service team, and she came forward with some information, and Lance called her. I mean, I didn't hear this, but I've read reports that he called her an alcoholic whore. Now it's been a little while since I was in torts back in law school, but I think that calling somebody a whore is defamation per se, as I recall.
Sure.
So that claim would seem to run on rails, and he also attacked the Andreos, Frankie Andreo and his wife, I forget her first name, but he attacked them in a similar manner. So, I think, far be it from me to give Lance advice or anything, but these are the people that whose lives were significantly altered as a result of Lance's actions. I can, whether SCA Promotions gets their money back or not, I'm not going to lose any sleep over that. But someone like Emma O'Reilly, who's just probably a damn close to minimum wage masseuse for the U.S. Postal Service team, just get destroyed like that. That doesn't sit well with people. So I think it behooves Lance to say, look, why don't we settle your claim now, and I will I'll pay you for that claim, and let's get that off the table now before all the rest of the wolves come out of the woodwork, and that $100 million I got in the bank is gone.
Right.
So. I think it really would, if Lance wants to make amends, I think he's got to go to those individuals and do everything that is within his power while he still has power, and by power I mean money. While he can still, while he can still make amends, because I don't think. For those people, I don't know that Lance's words at this point are going to be meaningful to them.
Right.
I think all he's got is some cash, and that's all he can give to them to heal their wounds to some extent.
Right, money talks. So you never know.
Yeah.
We also know that sponsors pulled the plug on, in supporting Lance. In particular, we know Nike was the big one, which sponsored his whole Live Strong campaign. And at one point in the interview, which absolutely shocked me, Lance Armstrong said that he would lose a projected $75 million of income in the future just as a result of this whole scandal. Mm-hmm. So could Lance's sponsors like Nike pursue a lawsuit against Armstrong in the future? And if so, what could those lawsuits be?
Yeah, well, I've been involved in negotiating and securing endorsement agreements for athletes over the years here. And, all of these contracts have a morals clause, and undoubtedly Lance violated the morals clause as a result of doping. So, I've seen many scenarios where an athlete will violate a morals clause in a sponsorship agreement. The vast majority of the time, a sponsor in that situation will simply terminate the agreement, accept the fact that that's money out the door, and not file a suit to go after that money. Mm-hmm. And really, one of the things, by filing a lawsuit, all they would be doing, by and large, is keeping in the association between the sponsor and Lance Armstrong in the public eye for a longer period of time, which, from a publicity standpoint, is not good. So, I think that most sponsors look at that and say, you know what, let's just cut our losses here. We don't want to file a lawsuit. It's just going to, that means for the next 2 years, our association with Lance Armstrong is going to remain in the headlines. What we need to do instead is to move on and build new associations between our products and other athletes and the consumer. So it's typically in these scenarios, it's very, very unlikely that sponsors go after money that was already paid. And also Lance, I think if they did come after that, he would have a decent argument that they already got the benefit of the bargain anyway. The reality is that during the time that he had his Tour de France run, whether it be Nike or Trek or Anheuser-Busch or whoever it may be, the association with Lance, they reaped the benefits of that. I mean, Trek sold a hell of a lot of bikes because Lance was on one of those bikes, for 7 years, for a 7-year run at the Tour de France. So, I think it's pretty unlikely that any of these sponsors tried to, recapture money paid.
Yeah, exactly. I agree. So, based on what millions witnessed last week, and we had just talked about this earlier about cycling being a dirty sport, do you see now, as a result of this interview, the UCI taking stricter measures along with WADA and USADA in making sure that doping is diminished in cycling? And I'm talking making a dirty sport at least a little bit less dirty now. Well, one of the things that I did find really fascinating in the interview is that, Lance said categorically that when he came back, that the biological passport changed everything. Essentially, I think what he was saying, if not explicitly, at least implicitly, is he was saying, look, during my 7-year run, you had to dope to compete. You had to, and then when I came back, so he's saying, hey, it was a level playing field. Everybody was doping. And then he said, when I came back, given that the biological passport was instituted, again, it was a level playing field. Everybody was clean because you can't beat the biological passport. Sure. In addition to that, during Lance's 7-year run, there was no test for EPO either. When there's a test for EPO, there's a bio passport. I mean, it's getting really hard to cheat in professional cycling, and I think really the bio passport is what does it. That just sets the marker, and if you see deviation from that, you know that there's something going on. So I think it's been made really difficult as a result of that. Sure, they can continue to make it, they can continue to tweak it, and to some extent, there will continue to be a cat and mouse game. I mean, there always has been, and there always will be a cat and mouse game on these issues. But it's gotten a hell of a lot harder with the biological passport to cheat. And I'm really hopeful that that Bradley Wiggins, is clean, and I have no reason to think otherwise. And I think in the context of the biological passport in the sport, I am assuming that he won clean, and I'm hopeful that this is a new beginning for the sport. Hopefully.
Yeah.
So, finally, do you think other sports like tennis or even golf, do you think those sports will begin to take stricter measures in cracking down on PED use based on what we saw with Lance Armstrong? Yeah. I mean, I just heard in the last day or two that the International Tennis Federation is considering adopting a biological passport regime also, and I think that was largely in response to this. If you're the head of the International Tennis Federation, you see what's happened to professional cycling
you got to get ahead of this. So I think, it certainly has repercussions across different sports, and I think sports are ratcheting up the effort. I don't think it's because of Lance per se, but I do think that other sports have seen what the widespread doping has done to the sport of professional cycling. I mean, for the past, through the mid 2000s, or even the past few years, a race isn't over at the finish line. It's over a few weeks later when all the drug testing has been completed, and the finishing order is then reshuffled, and all the drug cheats are DQ'd, and then and then the guy who finished sixth in the race is now the winner, and that's just a bad product from a spectator's perspective. And if it's a bad product from the spectator's perspective, all the sponsors and the networks and or anyone that is going to throw money into the sport, they're out. Rabobank was a long time supporter of a team in the Tour de France and across all the major tours. No small endeavor from a financial standpoint. Well, they finally just threw their arms up and they said, we're out. We're not going to be involved in professional cycling anymore. We just do not want to be associated with this. So, other leagues see that. Other sports see that, and they know that, like anything else, money speaks. So, once they see that, the sport is moving quickly into the direction of, absurdity, professional wrestling land, then they're gonna say, this just isn't worthy of our money. And with that, other sports and other leagues will react. I mean, baseball just instituted HGH testing.
Yep.
And that'll make it the first major U.S. pro sports league to institute HGH testing. Now, there's a huge loophole with the baseball HGH testing in that they're going to test at spring training and then again after the season, but there's not going to be any in-season HGH testing. So that's a problem. But you know what? It's a start, and the fact that they got it at all, given that you can't institute a program like that without a green light from the labor union, and the baseball labor union is perhaps the most powerful of them all. It's a step in the right direction, so I would expect that something like the biological passport is going to be adopted, across a broad range of sports, because it's in the long term, it's in their best interest. It's in the best interest of everyone. Sports are going to get really killed if they continue to go down the road of, we're just not sure if this is a true competition that we're watching here.
Definitely. And like you said, hopefully this change will be for the better, whether it's in cycling or golf, tennis, and as you correctly alluded to, baseball. So, maybe this is the beginning of what will be stricter measures for not only cycling but in various other sports. But this Lance Armstrong case is very interesting. A lot more has to develop, especially with respect to the whistleblower case. We still have to hear some news flourish with regard to that, so we're going to sit back and wait to hear from that. But Owen, great stuff. I really appreciate your insight on the whole Lance Armstrong case and the whole confession, him confessing to using PEDs. If you want to learn more about Owen and his firm, all that information will be down below in the description box. And Owen, thank you for being on Law and Batting Order.
Thanks, Tony. It's great to be here. We'll talk to you later.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.
That's the show. Leave all your comments down below, and be sure to visit Law and Batting Order at lawandbattingorder.com, as well as on Facebook and Twitter. Take care, guys. Welcome to a brand new episode of Law and Batting Order. I'm your host, Tony Iliakostas. Here are some quick hits from the past 2 weeks. Attention football fans, get ready for the Har Bowl. This year's Super Bowl will feature a very unique matchup between two head coaches who are brothers. John Harbaugh's Baltimore Ravens took down in an exclusive interview by Deadspin.com. It was discovered that Notre Dame linebacker Manti Te'o was the victim of a hoax involving his so-called girlfriend. From the details that were gathered, it was believed that Manti Te'o's girlfriend, who he met online, had died in September 2012 of leukemia. However, in December 2012, Te'o discovered that he had really been the victim of a very elaborate hoax. Many wondered if Te'o was in on it, but he has adamantly denied any involvement. He has made it very clear that he was a victim. The person behind the hoax has come out and apologized for his actions, but this may not be the last we hear about the Manti Te'o catfish scandal. Today's Order in the Court will be taking a look at Lance Armstrong's recent Broncos and the Patriots to reach their second Super Bowl in franchise history. Meanwhile, in the NFC, the San Francisco 49ers returned to glory as Jim Harbaugh's squad took down the Packers and the Falcons. While the 49ers have an edge on offense, both teams have very potent defenses, and I believe this game will boil down to defense. The 49ers and Ravens will face each other on February 3rd, and my hunch tells me that the Ravens will escape with the Super Bowl win down in New Orleans. The speculation is over. Lance Armstrong, the American cyclist who gripped the attention of millions during the late 90s and early 2000s with his 7 consecutive Tour de France wins, came clean last week in an exclusive interview with Oprah Winfrey about using performance-enhancing drugs. Armstrong admitted to using testosterone, EPOs, and other performance-enhancing drugs in an effort to gain an advantage in the sport of cycling. In a very coy fashion, Armstrong also talked about how his teammates on his cycling team also took part in using performance-enhancing drugs during several cycling races, including the Tour de France. A little later in today's episode, I'll be discussing Lance's confession and the legal ramifications that could ensue. It's not often you hear bizarre stories in sports, but this week marked one of the most bizarre headlines in college football history and perhaps all of sports history. Confession to using performance-enhancing drugs. For years, there has been speculation that American cyclist Lance Armstrong had been using performance-enhancing drugs during his 7-year Tour de France title run from 1998 to 2005. And alas, after years of wondering, Lance Armstrong finally came clean in an exclusive interview with Oprah Winfrey talking about his PED use. The discussion has now shifted from when Lance will come clean to what will happen as a result of coming clean. To help us break down this interview and the legal ramifications that could ensue for Lance Armstrong, it is my privilege to interview Owen Seitel. Owen is the co-founder and partner of his firm Idell & Seitel, which is based in San Francisco, California.